Morning, everyone. So sorry we took a break last week. I think Independence Day. So Shreyas and I and the team, everyone deserved a break. So we just decided to take a Saturday off. But we are back with next session, which is on climate change law, policy, and climate action. We have Eeshan Chaturvedi and Abhayraj Naik speaking today. But before that, just a few housekeeping announcements. So a lot of you know about us, but just that we are a knowledge sharing platform where we try to bring scholars, practitioners, academics together to have a discussion, have a dialogue, further our understanding about various topics. And it's also an informal way. So we really encourage you to participate, use the chat section only because to reduce the noise, I guess. But definitely put your comments as well as your questions in the chat section. Also, there are the community guidelines as well as the ways to connect with Asian Pathfinders, Eeshan and Abhayraj. So you can find the links there. So you can use that too. In terms of our guiding principles, like I said earlier, we want to be an open forum to have a constructive dialogue and knowledge share. We want to bring different areas of research, be it academics, practitioners, together only because we all end up operating in a lot of our silos, and that's been my experience, my colleague Shreyas's experience, and a lot of other people in this field. So this is just a way for us to further our understanding about topics, possibly find research collaborations to work together, because it just helps. A lot of us work in different ideas. Just bringing these ideas together is a good way to further the research in such kind of topics. So so how do we execute our idea? Like I said, we want to create a knowledge repository for the community. It's as much as our community as yours, so please do share your suggestions, how we can make this better. The cornerstones are these weekly fireside chats we hold, and also we have different social media presence where we like to continue our engagement beyond the Saturdays at 11 a.m. that we meet. So so these are just the potential topics, and I think I know it's a very vast list, but it's just a way of trying to have different areas covered. We've had, this is, I think, our third edition on climate change. That does show you how important this topic is, but also geopolitics, COVID-19 as we are living through that, humanitarian assistance, terrorism, all these things. Like today, there's a report of ISIS operatives arrested in Delhi, and these things are still happening in the current times of COVID-19. So a lot of other issues sometimes get missed, and this is a way for us to have these discussions. So guidelines, I know we all are mature individuals, so we don't need it, but just that please respect the views of others, but please don't shy away from expressing yourself also. That's why I said at the start, please put your comments, questions in the chat box. Respect intellectual property. If you want to use anything that the speakers have said here, please reach out to us or the speakers. You know, their LinkedIn and the Twitter handles are there. So reach out to them to ask permission. As we were saying earlier, do not use unparliamentary languages. Anyone who does use any abusive or any profane or threatening languages would definitely be removed, and you'll be barred for any future events. Please don't make us do that. We haven't done that yet, and we'd like to continue not to do this. So please. A disclaimer before we start that the views expressed by Eeshan here are that of Eeshan and not any organization that he's associated with. So please remember this. These are just a few upcoming sessions. Next week, we have the effect of COVID-19 on the global aviation industry. I think flying was a very normal thing for us, and traveling, and how has this been affected in the times of COVID-19, and what would be the scenario after we do hopefully pass over this sooner or later. So that, and then I think in September, we have two, I don't know, the bigwigs, the pioneers in Indian science, I would say, speaking with us, and we're really lucky. We have Dr. Anil Kakodkar, who is the former chairman of Atomic Energy Commission of India. He'll be speaking on 12th of September. And on 26th September, we have Dr. A.S. Kiran Kumar, who is the former chairman of ISRO. So they will be coming and speaking about, obviously, the field that they have so much contribution to. So definitely look out for our social media pages for that detail. And I'm sure you guys know how to get in touch with me, Shreyas, or uh, Fireside Chats, but just the details here. One announcement, I know that a lot of you have reached out to us in the past if you want a certificate. We were happy to issue it. Just a few things is write to us on firesidechats.asia@gmail.com with your full name, as well as in the current video. If you have the session, please have your full name there. So when we record your name, we do have the full name there. So it's just as a consistency, because a lot of us dial in from phones or tablets, so sometimes those names are there and your name is not there. So please do that, if you, especially if you want a certificate. And moving on to today's session, like I said, we have Eeshan and Abhayraj. So Eeshan, he is the environment and energy lawyer. He's a scholar. He is the founder of an environmental consultancy, NV Pole. He's also the co-director for global policy, excuse me, Global Policy, Diplomacy and Sustainability's Fellowship, GPODS, and he's the Assistant Dean at the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability. He's also the member of prestigious global organizations such as World Commission on Environmental Law, International Association for Water Law, Rome, Global Network for Human Rights and Environment, and Global Policy Insights. He has a master's in environmental law and policy from Stanford Law School, where he was selected as one of the top 20 rising environmental leaders. And he dives in astrophysics, so I'm sure Eeshan will find the session of Dr. S. Kumar very interesting next month. But yeah, and we have Abhayraj. Abhayraj is an advisor, consultant, educator based in Bangalore. He is currently the visiting faculty at Azam Premji University, Bangalore, where he teaches law and justice in globalizing world and on climate justice in India. He has earlier been a faculty at National Law School of India, the Jindal Law Global Law School, the Minnesota Studies in International Development, India program, and extreme learning. He has been a consultant with the government of Karnataka on reviewing the state level environmental clearance systems, and co-author of Green Tapism, a review of the EIA notification, uh, and also released, which was released by the Environmental Support Group Bangalore. So he also has co-founded the non-for-profit Initiative for Climate Change. So the links for those, NVPOL, GPODS, Initiative for Climate Change, if you want to check out their work, it's in the chat section. And I'm going to stop speaking and pass it on to Eeshan. So Eeshan, all yours.
Thank you so much, Pallavi. I mean, we've been doing this for about 4 or 5 months, going through all of these webinars, and while I think my oratory skills have taken a downturn, one thing that I've never gotten used to is sit through your own introduction. And every time this happens, I think to myself that the next time I'm a part of such a webinar, I should probably reduce my introduction to 2 lines or something, and so that it is not that awkward lull of 3 minutes or 4 minutes that I have to sit through. But thank you very much. At the very beginning, I'd like to congratulate, as I have done in the past, Pallavi, Shreyas, and the Fireside Chats team of Asian Pathfinders. I think you guys are doing a tremendous job. Especially, I know that you're covering a lot of topics, and some of the topics uh, I'm not an expert in, but seem very interesting. But because you also substantially cover climate change, I think that's a very big contribution to the field, because I think both Abhay and I would agree that one of the biggest things you could do for climate action is to get a conversation going, a positive dialogue going. So as long as there are 25 participants you're hearing or thinking about these issues, that creates a chain reaction and probably leads to something better in the time to come. So congratulations and thank you to the team organizing this. I also noticed that you have a aviation webinar podcast lined up in the time to come, and if time permits, Abhay and I could probably talk about the role of the aviation industry in climate change, because just a heads up, if in case I'm not able to attend that podcast, do pass on this question: how do you solve the issue of one seat on a London to New York flight being equivalent of melting of 3 square meters of polar ice? So if that is the magnitude of, that aviation has on climate change, then it's not just the pandemic and aviation in light of the pandemic, but aviation in light of climate change that needs to be reconsidered. And this is all with the subtext that aviation is only 3% of the effect of industries and climate change. And that's another conversation altogether, but that was my own housekeeping and I'm done with it now. So thank you everyone for joining in. And we've been given a very interesting task to talk about climate change law and policy. And whenever in my classes or in my speaking engagements, when I have to deal with a subject that deals with law and policy per se, I like to think of it as a student and go to the basic questions. So if you're talking about climate change, you're talking about environment. And the natural corollary is, what is environment at the very beginning? Okay, for you to frame a law about a subject, you need to know what the subject is. So the Indian legislation, the Environment Protection Act, and later the National Green Tribunal Act of 2010, both of them have defined environment in the same terms, and they basically say land, water, air, human, flora, fauna, and our interrelationships. I'm obviously paraphrasing, our interrelationships amongst each other. All of that is environment. So if you just put it in context, the air, the water, the land, the flora and fauna, humans, and our interrelationship amongst each other is environment. Basically, in my understanding, this covers almost everything. So to frame a law on a subject that covers everything is always challenging. It is not as frameworked and strategic as a simple law on, say, right to information that only covers one specific aspect of the human life. Environment, thus, by its very nature, covers every aspect of every human life, our interactions and such. But to continue with this definition would be defeating the purpose of a discussion with intellectuals like Abhay, because I want it to be a conversation, not a lecture. And the first question that I'd raise is this definition right? Is this definition limiting? Is this definition too explorative? Is this definition too ambitious? My personal opinion is that environment is not just our relation to and our interrelationships with all of these elements. Because if you put it in context of what the universe is, okay? And as Pallavi mentioned, I also am a pseudo astrophysics enthusiast. So I'd put it in those terms. And I'm sure some of the participants would know a lot better and a lot more than I do. So, but this is my understanding. Universe is made up of, and when I say universe, I mean the world, space, galaxies, you know, all of the universe is made up of 5 major elements. There's hydrogen, and this is their order: hydrogen, most in abundance. Then there's helium, which is an inert gas. So helium, then we have oxygen, we have carbon. And as we've been studying in the science books throughout our lives, we have others as the 5th element. So we don't have to go into others. If you talk of human beings, which are the 5 major elements you're made of, or 4 major elements in that ranking you're made of? It's hydrogen, it's helium isn't there because it's an inert gas, plus if humans do inhale helium, to a certain extent, you just sound weird and then you kind of die of poisoning. So let's take that out. There's hydrogen, there's oxygen, there's carbon, and then there's others, right? So at the very intrinsic level, you have to be aware that whatever you're a part of, whether you call it environment, universe, humanity, flora, fauna, you're just a minuscule part of something that is a lot bigger than you. And I don't want to get philosophical about this, but I'm just trying to define my idea of environment, to limit it to only interrelationships between me and the flora, me and the fauna, and me and the land is, I think, philosophically being unjust to that definition, because as we're reaching the space barrier, as we're crossing the Mars barrier, we're realizing that the universe or our understanding of environment is a lot more than what is predefined on planet Earth at this point in time. Tomorrow, if we have an issue with solar cells wastage, would you consider throwing it out in space, thinking that this is not my issue? ये किसी और की problem है? You would not do that. So it has to be a very expansive definition that needs to consider aspects that are happening, that have happened, and that will happen in the future. So with that short insight into my understanding of environment, I'd pass it on to Abhay. Again, I want it to be a conversation, and I'm really looking forward to his views on these sort of things. And then we can probably get into a more substantive discussion on environmental law and climate change and climate policy.
Perfect. I think over to you, Abhay. And once Abhay is done speaking, we could just possibly have questions from the audience, anyone till then. Thanks, Abhay, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Pallavi. Thanks, Eeshan. And thank you to everyone who's turned up this Saturday morning. It's delightful to be a part of these very nobly oriented sessions that from the get-go have given me a sense of what someone like Maslow would identify as the acme of human existence, where you're not really trying to get something for yourself, but you're trying to really contribute to the expression of others' aspirations. And I love these forms of community building that are all about sharing insights, building up collaborative possibilities, and allowing us to sort of take a break from the rat race that most of us, like it or not, find ourselves occupied with, and reflect on what's going on in the world. What does that mean to me? What am I doing with this learning? What may I want to do going forward, possibly in this area, right? And it's rare to find such opportunities, and I certainly am delighted to find myself in one such forum at this present moment. So over the course of this conversation, I hope to direct some of my comments to both the specifics of climate change law and policy in India, and what for me is even more important than the specifics, an understanding of the contextual terrain or the larger universe within which climate change law and policy operates, right? And I think that sort of prefatory point is important at the outset, and it's also a nice sort of response to Eeshan's very interesting way of getting us started, which is thinking about what does environment itself mean. And I'm the sort of person who is not very politically correct more often than not. I'm an angry environmental activist half the time, and I have no problem with attacking my discipline, which is law, and sort of saying what Eeshan said, but in different language. Let me sort of suggest at the outset that how law, both Indian law and law across the world, treats environment is incredibly reductionist. It takes something that is full of beauty and magic and complexity and uncertainty, and squeezes it into a definition of 25 words that lawyers can play around with in courts, right? And the way in which law usually reduces environment, and I think Eeshan sort of alluded to this in his comments as well, is firstly, it takes the social, the political, and the human dimension out of the environment. It reduces the word environment just to ecological, geographical, and chemical reactions, right? And so the entire tortured complexity of human existence, how people relate to nature, how nature is vital for life itself, how nature, if you believe some theorists, has a life of its own, particularly thinkers in the Gaia tradition who think of the earth as one big organism, right? How nature, let's talk about a river or a forest, uh, is often the site of violent contestation between human beings and between communities and the state. All of that rich complexity, sometimes cruel, sometimes beautiful, sort of gets squeezed out by a reductionist approach to nature. The second sort of response, and my final rejoinder, if you wish, to what Eeshan said is, uh, I think there's something beautiful in how he got us thinking about terrain that is a bit unusual for people who are talking about climate change law and policy, which is uh, a sense of uncertainty about a future that we are uh, sort of moving towards to, but don't have a clear picture on, right? In that sense, when we're talking about environmental law, or specifically when we're talking about climate change law, I would suggest that both because of the complexity of how Earth systems operate, and the operation of Earth systems determines what is our environment or what is our climate to a large extent, but also because of the limitations of human knowledge about how the world works. We pretend that we know everything and everything is probable and mappable and calculable, and we have it all figured out. But if you really look at the universe of what is known and unknown, there's a lot of uncertainty that's still around us. And our definitions of environment sort of forget this. So, so the path to the future is almost mechanistically charted out. We know where we are going. We know what will happen with the environment. And I would suggest that it's actually very, very enlightening to bring back almost uh, you could call it a scientific uncertainty approach based on what Heisenberg told us long back, that there will always be a little bit of uncertainty. Or you could call it a mystic approach, which is sometimes you just don't know what is it that makes this world tick. You could be religious and say, I can never know the divine, right? And some people, especially in the environmental arena, have an eco-spirituality approach to thinking about the environment. But even without a religious or a spiritual basis, you can acknowledge that there is so much in the way that life has evolved that you don't understand at the moment. And therefore, a definition of the environment, I would humbly submit, must be capacious enough to accommodate for this uh, almost humble relationship with who we are in the world, how small a part of the world we are, as Eeshan suggested, and how little we know about what might happen tomorrow. So I think with those potentially mystical thoughts, I'll pass it back to Eeshan.
Okay, I actually have a question for both of you before I let it go. And I already see another question, but I'll ask the moderator. You did speak about the very basic about environment and how we need to have a better understanding of it in your different ways. I guess what I was trying to figure out is having these sessions and all, it's much smaller subset of the population. How does a government or a policy maker bring this understanding of environment and the broader understanding of environment so that people start acting on it? But it has to start from a very policy perspective. How do we bring that aspect into the policy realm of furthering our understanding about the environment? Any one of you can start, I guess.
Abhay, do you want to take that, or?
You can go, Eeshan. I mean, I'm comfortable either which way.
Okay, so I'll probably like start and then you can continue. But see, first of all, I have very strong opinions about what the role of a government should be. and government, to put it very basically, is a service provider, and we give it a task and it does it. I do not expect the government to educate us or make us aware of things. That falls upon our education system, that falls upon traditions and community practices that are inculcated through good practices that should reflect on. So the confusion that occurs uh, for law generally, and policy as a function of law, or law as a function of policy, is that generally laws are framed, and I say generally because obviously, being a lawyer, there are always exceptions to everything. So as a general statement, laws are formed when customs are entrenched into the society, and then they take shape of a law, and the society abides by it. Obviously, there are different theories. There's social contract and and a bunch of other theories, but this is the basic framework, the generally accepted framework of law. So if a community is woke enough about certain aspects of its existence, whether it be in relation to their interactions with environment, or their interactions with education system, or energy sector, or any of the ministries that you want to look at, MSME or whichever, uh, that should drive the government to put in policy changes that make a difference, to execute the vision of the society, and not the other way around. One. But if we're talking strictly on the terms, in terms of what is happening today, and there's a serious push that is needed towards environment, both internationally and domestically, then the easiest thing to do is to have a positive dialogue started. Now, these positive dialogues could be in the form of this webinar or podcast. It could also be an outcome that was not deliberated or expected. So what has happened with the EIA draft, the notification that has been covered by the newsrooms quite significantly, the idea was actually the opposite of getting a conversation started about environment. The government would have wanted that this just chup chap goes and this becomes a law and that's about it. But sometimes when there's a positive conversation that is happening, that has either incited the public or awakened the public, that promotes education. So if a normal person who does not have anything to do with environmental law hears about the EIA notification in the news, he'll go and maybe give 2 minutes of his time to knowing what EIA is. So apart from general positive dialogues that are either outcomes that are intended or not, I think government's role is very limited, other than giving a wholesome education in public schools on environment. And it is the community practices and growth of intellectual society that should promote environmental conversations.
Abhay,
But I'd love to hear Abhay's views on this, because I'm not sure which side of the line he lies on.
Yeah, I think I'll come at this a bit stridently. So I personally believe that it's a very important question you ask, Pallavi, and I think it's a question that we must constantly keep asking, and in a sense also not hesitate sometimes, like the little kid in the fable, to point out that the emperor is naked and not wearing any clothes. Because my own sort of reading of environmental policy and the history of environmental law in India is that over 70 odd years, the Indian state has been incredibly non-participatory when it comes to the formulation of environmental policy. And if you read scholars such as Ravi Ranjan, based at the University of California in Santa Cruz, he points out that, the environmental discourse in India has gone through about 3 phases. And the phase that we are in right now is a technicalization of everything related to the environment. So it's almost like a scientific, technical accountancy discourse has captured the space of environmental policy making, right? And my sort of orientation here is that people including people from indigenous communities, but definitely people from villages across India, resource-dependent communities, but also people from neighborhoods within our cities. It could be a neighborhood in Delhi or a ward in Bangalore. It doesn't matter. I think people must be not just aware of the environmental policies that in that sense regulate the habitat that they occupy, but must be co-creators of that policy, right? And sort of across the world at this moment, you are seeing this happen. So this is not a pipe dream in that sense, right? You have a French Citizens Assembly that is actually deciding how the French economy will have a climate smart COVID recovery plan, right? You're seeing the same thing that's happening in Scotland and UK. Whereas in India, what has happened is uh, people have been totally excluded from any position on the table. I mean, and I put myself on the side of the voiceless, let's say, subaltern who's affected by environmental policy. We fight for a place at the table in the first place. And uh, I won't place the blame entirely on the government because that's too easy to do. And I think the government and the Indian Republic has made phenomenal strides in general from 1947 to today. But I think a part of the mindset that continues in India is a colonial mindset today, right? We continue to, Babus continue to treat regular people as, hey, we will tell you what to do, as opposed to you are sovereign over the resources you sort of depend on, and you decide what you want to do, how that river should flow, what should happen to seeds, should biotechnology be allowed, should more roads be built or more footpaths be created. You decide, right? We continue to have, at least my indictment of policy in India is it's a very colonial mindset, and we do need a decolonization of the mind. And that will happen through, as Eeshan suggested, events such as this. It will happen through sort of people constantly striving to translate. You know, law and policy needs to be translated in a language that is accessible to everyone. I don't just mean translate from English to Tamil, let's say. I mean translate in a way that people can understand.
Or
And
Karnataka, because that's the relevant issue going around. Kannada,
or
basically.
it could be Kannada, yes, given the Justice Abhay Oka of the Karnataka High Court has
Yeah.
been giving the national government a tough time. So I think for me that responsibility lies with the educational system, with the government, with civil society organizations, and with people. I wouldn't blame just the government. I think everybody needs to orient themselves towards, hey, let's participate in policy making. Let's ask for a position at the table. Let's not sort of limit ourselves to signing one petition saying, please listen to us. Right? It's our right in that sense, our constitutional right. So, so I think it's a very important question you ask, and of course we need a Swaraj-oriented perspective to making it happen in the rather radical way I'm suggesting. But that is, I think, for me, what needs to happen.
Yeah, I think.
Pallavi, if I might just be allowed to add just a couple of pointers, which
Sure.
even though I'm pretty sure that it'll fade in front of
We
how Abhay just did.
already have a few questions, so you add your point, and I'm going to also,
Quickly.
yeah, sure.
So one thing, because you asked us about environmental education and how the government can promote it, and I think Abhay very eloquently covered it, and that added with my 2 cents. I think that covers it. One thing that I want to make clear, and this goes to the root of environmental awareness, which is accumulation of a bunch of things, which is what I wanted to list out quickly. If you look at the Aarhus Convention of the EU, you look at even the basics of environmental law in India, or globally, environment law and policy is based on 4 major things. Okay, I'll put it in 3 major things, and then I'll tell you what the 4th one is. First is access to information, right? Second is public consultation or public participation. And the third is access to justice, right? So if your rights have been defeated in the first two factions of access to information or public consultation, you have the right to justice on those fronts, which is what Abhay kind of referred to when he said that public consultation and people should be taking the decisions. However, when you take, so now this structure presupposes that I am environmentally educated and I'd want this information, right? There's some presupposition happening there that I know that this coal mine might harm my biodiversity. So I want to know more about it and I want to access this information. So that is the fourth element, that environmental education presupposes, and then these three are the tools that help you actualize your environmental goals as a community. Now, the fourth thing in amidst all of this is execution. Execution, once these four stages are covered, is where the government should come in, or the judiciary, any of the arms of the government should come in. And they should facilitate each of those issues in a way that the public receives environmental education, access to information, public consultation, participation, and access to justice, so that, again, actualization of environmental rights can happen. So just a not so brief snippet on what I thought about this.
I think also, Eeshan, you summed everything what you both have said in those perfectly in those 4 points, so that's great. We have a question from Tanishk, and I think that would be a good next step for our discussion. It's related specifically to potential regulations and policies that affect automobile, agriculture, especially the tractor, the construction equipments, and what needs to be kept in mind as an international trade and risk analysis practitioner for an Indian company operating in, say, Africa or West Asia. So I think we're going very regional here, but I think these things actually, industry-specific regulations or policies matter a lot when we're looking at climate issues. So if, Eeshan, why don't you go first, and then Abhay can add in.
Happy to. So Tanishk, what started out as a 10-mark question ended up being a 2-mark question when you started including the specifics of the question. But I'd like to treat it like a 10-mark question if that's okay. Even though I'll keep it short, I understand that we have questions pouring in. So first of all, when you talk of automobile industry, agricultural industry, construction industry, or manufacturing industry, because you're referring to construction equipments, these are words that have meanings across in like all angles, each degree of 360 degrees, right? So if you want to look at automobiles, you could look at it from a manufacturing perspective, sales perspective, labor laws, retail, consumer, and then now you have the circular economy, so a closed loop system, open loop system, reuse, recycle, all of those things come in. I'm going to address it specifically in terms of the two main laws that I think are relevant, or the conversations of which are relevant in today's times. One, which I mentioned at the very beginning, something that the Delhi government has done, and to its credit, the central government had come out with a basic policy called FAME2, FAME2 policy about electric vehicles. And a push is being seen by governments, by the Indian government and governments around the globe. And I use the word push very, I'm aware of the implications of the word push, and I use it for that reason, because it's not a regulation where you're allowing something or disallowing something. Electric vehicles are being pushed through positive and negative incentives. How that is happening is, if you look at the New Delhi policy on EV, what they're saying is that we'll give you 30,000 INR rupees debate. For that, you have to specify and satisfy certain conditions. And we are going to disincentivize the pollution producing cars and vehicles. So this is one thing. However, my basic issue with this happening in India is, and again, I want to talk about this as much as I can on each platform that I can. It does not matter if you have all cars which are electric, if your source of electricity is thermal, if your source of electricity is coal. So unless you switch to solar, and that solar power is funneling the electricity into my car, I do not care if you have only EV cars on the road. And to its credit, the Delhi government has mentioned renewables would be preferable, but that's about it. There's no regulation that says that there should be this much allotment of megawattage or gigawattage to Delhi, which should power charging stations. That way, the cars are only running on clean energy. So that is one issue that I wanted to bring up. The second, in relation to automobiles, at least, and Kanish, because we're short in time, I'm happy to connect with you and anyone who wants to discuss this in a more detailed manner. The second issue is with the EIA notification, the Environment Impact Assessment notification, which is kind of like the meat of the topic, which is ironical because meat has a lot of environmental impacts as well.
Sorry, Eeshan.
But,
we already have a question
yeah.
on EIA. So if you want to continue adding about EIA also in this comment of yours.
What I could do is I could give it to Abhay because I don't want to take too much of
No,
the
definitely,
meat
but
of the
that's okay.
topic.
We already have a question on EIA. So adding to the automobile, and Chaturvedi has actually asked if you can speak a little bit more on the EIA. I think both of you could. So Tanish.
So what I'll do, if that's okay, Pallavi, I'll just quickly address the automobile part of the EIA, and then Abhay could cover EIA, and then I could add if there's anything of significance from my end. Even though
Sure.
having heard Abhay for quite some length and seen his writing works, I doubt if there'll be anything left for me, but I'll give it a try anyway. In relation to the EIA and the automotive industry, so how EIA notification of 1994, 2006, and now 2020 work, how these notifications work is that you have a bunch of industries that are called scheduled industries that find themselves as a schedule to the notification itself. So if you're in the schedule, you are basically under the purview of the notification. An automobile industry, at least in the 2006 notification, was within the purview of EIA. I haven't checked if they have been released from the list, which is a controversial topic in itself. But if you fall under that purview, you then have to go into the next stage of assessment. So whether I'm a big industry, if I'm a big industry, my environmental clearance comes from the central government. If I'm a smaller industry, it comes from, I'm a B1 project, so it comes from the state government, SIA. And if I'm even smaller, it still comes from state, but with lesser rigmarole of assessment and everything. So that's how the EIA notification and the implications on the automotive industry work. Obviously, there's a lot to be discussed in detail in specifics of the capacity of the industry, spatial extent, sociological, environmental, economic factors. And I really want to address at some point the whole concept of CBA, cost-benefit analysis within the realm of environment. But I think we'll be losing out on quite a bit of discussion if I go into that. So over to you, Abhay.
I think, Abhay, just a few points on Tanishka's question about policies and regulations affecting the automobile, agriculture, and construction equipment industry, and possibly your views on the EI both bundled together. Sorry, I'm going to say for request you both to keep it short because we already have like 7 or 8 questions. And Ashutosh, I know your question came in pretty early, but it's specifically to the climate lawyer. So that's going to be the last question to wrap up the session. So I thought I'll just give it as. So.
Thank you. Let me just, I think the way in which Tanishq will get full clarity on how potential regulations and policy affect these very discrete sectors, and also what might be the context of for an Indian company operating in Africa and West Asia, is to understand that at the present moment, there is no comprehensive climate law that applies to regulating business enterprises in India. And there is no very specific obligation focused policy in place. You do have a national action plan on climate change. You do have state action plans on climate change. But at the moment, these are all wish lists. And they're not getting to the level of regulating corporate decision making in very, very tangible ways. Like Eeshan suggested, you are seeing some cities and some states make a move perhaps towards an EV policy, right? And that is definitely a sort of very, very tangible development that one must watch carefully. But right now, it is still pretty much a laissez-faire, do as you wish, as long as you're complying with existing corporate law and environmental law under the forest laws, the Air Act, the Water Act, and the EIA regulation. Now, if your perspective is a slightly long-term perspective, which is what I see in your question, it makes sense to note that across the world, big businesses and medium enterprises and the investor community are now taking stock of a business's carbon footprint. And something like the Ceres network, which has brought together some of the biggest investors in the world, I'll just type that out. They have been successfully lobbying with really big companies, including a company such as Shell, to get Shell to make a commitment to carbon neutrality by a particular period, right? If you've been tracking the news, you would have seen a company like Infosys, along with Amazon, also made a declaration of carbon neutrality because it's part of a larger network. So what I'm suggesting is, even in these three sectors, automobile, agriculture, construction equipment, given the nature of India's commitments under the Paris Agreement, which requires a move to renewable energy, requires additional forest sinks, and requires, most importantly, for the building construction point, that our emission energy intensity will reduce. So basically, buildings are going to have to become more energy efficient if our requirement under Paris is to be met. And it's likely, though we can't be sure, that investors will start putting pressure on businesses to be more climate compliant. The final point I'll make on this is very, very recently, in August 11th, if I'm not mistaken, the Corporate Affairs Ministry has released a business responsibility and sustainability report framework, right? And they've already said that the Corporate Affairs Ministry will work with the market regulator SEBI to basically ensure that companies are reporting on how responsible they are as businesses. So in terms of agriculture or automobiles or construction industry, given how these environmental, social, and governance indicators in the world of corporate law are usually outlined, supply chains are slowly going to get monitored. Carbon emissions are slowly going to get tracked. And India is moving in that direction. Traditional carbon intensive business will resist. You might see a delay, but even a company like Reliance, for example, is pivoting away from carbon intensive mining and energy projects to a data driven, less carbon intensive approach. On the EIA regulations of 2020 at least are quite climate blind, and I have written about this. The Initiative for Climate Action made submissions to the ministry exactly on this point, right? But there's nothing that actually stops citizens from pointing out that this EIA report for this fertilizer producing company is absolutely blind as to how much nitrogen the fertilizer company is putting into the atmosphere, right? And technically, climate considerations are under the purview of environment impact assessment law. The National Green Tribunal in Ridhima Pandey's case, which they decided in 2019, said there's no reason to believe that climate considerations are not a part of the EIA consideration. So the takeaway is, if you're a long-sighted industry, and especially if in the international world you want to get good points for being a sustainable enterprise, which will soon be very financially rewarded as well, given that investors are recognizing this shift. Insurance companies are dropping carbon intensive companies. There's a decisive move away from fossil fuel intensive industry. You would be smart to integrate climate friendly practices, not just in your production, but in your entire supply chain as well. Hope that's helpful, and happy to connect for more specific advisory.
Okay. Uh, so in interest of time, what I'm going to do is ask one question to Eeshan and the next one to Abhay. So Eeshan, I think one of the questions is, uh, what is the role of lobbying in policy making in countries like India and USA? Uh, does the recent rise in climate change sentiment, like Fridays for Future movement, make any difference for policymakers? The question is by Prajwal Patil. Yeah. So over to you,
Hi,
Sean.
Prajwal. I mean, given, let me just frame that in my head so that it's not as politically incorrect that as it might turn out to be. So lobbying, let's look at lobbying then. Lobbying in the US is a legitimate activity where, even when you're running for the presidential race, you're supported by the tobacco industry, you're supported by the petroleum coal industry and such. In India, it is all very hush-hush. So you cannot come out in the open as a consortium of coal industry, factories, manufacturers, refiners, and say that I support the X party or the blue party or green party or orange party. So what that does is that while the money flow, the employment sectors that these industries provide employment to, the vote banks of these industries, sway the decisions of the hushed tones under which these industries support the government. It is not all out in the open, and anything that is opaque or scared to be out in the open has the option of being illegal or ill-treated, or funny things might happen in that process. However, I do think that there's a general trend now, as Abhay mentioned, Reliance, I know Vedanta, Aramco, which is basically an oil company, but that is investing in clean energy. And I think more and more you see now, because of the Fridays for Future as an example, but various other trends that we've been following over the past decade, these industries are also becoming environmentally conscious. Now, it's a business, and I do not expect them to have a conscience when it comes to environment. That is not their job, and I understand that. But even if they're having to do it as a PR exercise and it is helping the environment eventually, I think I'm on board with that. So even if they want, as they say, justice should not only be done, but also appear to be done. If they're only doing this for the appearance sake, that they're moving towards a trend where they're funding more environmental efforts, where they're rehabilitating mines or coming up with educational institutes that are researching on climate and environment with a vested interest eventually. That is a good trend. However, lobbying does happen. I have seen lobbying in facets that I would still be surprised of engulfing in my thought process, but they happen, and it's a pity that it's all happening behind closed doors because it leaves a lot to our imagination.
Abhay, I'm going to ask you the question from Charumati, and Eeshan, I'll ask you the next question right itself, so give you time to come up with the answer. So Eeshan, the question is from Charumati. Do you think the increased focus on environment in the SDGs global commitment will benefit environmental lawmaking in India, or is environmental policy making such as a such a national issue that the SDGs will make no big difference? Eeshan, for you, the question is from Shravan. What is the fate of current millennium?
I've read it, Pallavi.
Okay, perfect. So that's for you. And Charu's question is for Abhay first.
Thank you. Thanks, Charumati. So I think as things stand, the increased focus on environment in the SDGs uh, does not have a predominant role in policy making in India, because policy making in India, I mean, if you actually look at the political economy of environmental policy making in India, it is very much based on entrenched interests, including the interests of big business. Uh, and I mean, while Prime Minister Modi might enjoy going to the UN and receiving awards, etc., that stuff does not translate back into domestic policy making, right? Modi goes and gets an award for being a climate champion and then gives away huge ancient biodiverse forests for coal mining, destroying indigenous communities and lots of biodiversity. So at the moment, and given the history of policy making in India, the SDGs have not translated through yet. But the beauty of the present moment is everything is up for questioning, and there are transitions and what I call ruptures, right? So we don't know whether suddenly a visionary leader, it could be a judge or even a businesswoman, will say that I am committing my enterprise to SDG 13, which is about climate action, right? And you do the sort of joy of being in a circus that is India is that you have all kinds of characters, right? And you don't know finally who's going to grab the spotlight and whose decisions are going to win the day. So we are building SDG specific vocabularies for our domestic policy making, but it's not yet the dominant vocabulary. And again, I keep going back to, it's easy to blame fingers. The work really has to be done by everybody who's interested in the environment in deploying SDG specific language in your court petitions, in your public opinions, in your asks from the regulators, right? Unless it's too easy to assume the government is always malicious. Sometimes the government actually needs a clear signal from the entire set of stakeholders. And if it makes sense, as Eeshan was suggesting, for a business to actually work within the SDG framework, the government will also soon bring that thinking into its policies. And we are seeing the movement towards it, but it's not happening quick enough, and it's not happening in as deep a way as I would like. So I hope some catalysis happens there.
Over to you, Sean.
Yeah. So just to, I really agree with everything that Abhay said, and just to top it off, I really like the point that if something does not go according to your liking, or if it does not go at the pace that you want, or if there are flawed drafts being promulgated, it is easier to assume maliciousness, but let's not do that at the first instance. I know there's a reason why every government, like I said, businesses are meant to have a profit motive. And as long as it reflects through industry standards or otherwise in their environmental efforts, that is fine. And the government is supposed to be a service provider and not a vote bank gainer. But if they're doing that, but in the process, if they're concentrating on environment, that is all that we should care about. We should develop community understanding of environment, and agitation is something that we should absolutely empower. Coming to the question that Shravan has asked, and I'll just read it out for everyone's convenience. What is the fate of current millennium cities with the current climate conditions, and how the politicians play a role? So the fate of the current, by millennium cities, I'm assuming you mean, the metros and cosmopolitan cities of India,
I think,
and not the smart cities. Right?
Ishan, I think he just means the cities like Gurgaon, especially I think in the light of what happened this week in Gurgaon with the entire city of golf course roads and everything being under, like we were speaking yesterday also about it. I think that's, the angle that's coming here. So yeah.
So there are one thing that we must take pride in as Indians is that we came up with this concept of Vasudev Kutumbakam, right? Vasudev Kutumbakam is the Sanskrit word which means the world is one family, and hence boundaries and lines drawn in the sand or lines drawn in blood, as Bill Clinton said, cannot differentiate environmental aspects, at least, as they do not differentiate between which birds will stay on this side of the fence and which birds will stay on that side of the fence. So if the climate conditions of a Gurgaon has to be bettered, the climate conditions of Shanghai have to be bettered, the climate conditions of Stockholm has to be bettered. So basically, it's a very global phenomenon. Climate change and environment it cannot be restricted within a bubble. It's not a COVID crisis. So, and it's a lot bigger than the COVID crisis as a piece of warning here. So there's no one-stop solution for Gurgaon per se. What are the solutions then, even if you're looking at it holistically in a national, international level? First thing, which is not addressed as much, especially in law and policy debates, is the rise in technology. We lawyers pride ourselves in knowledge of Latin terms, but one of the most important Latin terms that we have been taught, we've all forgotten somewhere, which is this phrase called ceteris paribus. Now, ceteris paribus literally means all other things remaining constant, right? And most of the laws are promulgated and legislated upon when all other things will remain constant. This law will have this effect. That does not work with environment, because climate change is happening on an every day. The wind is blowing every day, sun is rising every day, rains are coming every day. So you cannot have these things in a watertight compartment and then legislate accordingly. So there needs to be flexibility. Because of this flexibility, what do you count on apart from policies? Because policies, because of the ceteris paribus and the lack of it, will always have different impacts on the changing times. The one thing that is within our control is technology. And we lawyers hate the term. We don't like to address it because we don't know much about it. And I do not know much about it either. But I know one fact that when light amplification by stimulated emissions of radiation was conceptualized by Einstein, which is the acronym for which is laser today. He did not think that technology would be used to swipe barcodes in supermarkets. He just came up with the concept. But the technology has now progressed so much that we're using it in our everyday lives. So the fast tags that are issued, the barcodes in the supermarkets, all of that is today, 80 years, 90 years down the line, a consequence of one technology that emerged then. So we must invest in technology, R&D, and come up with solutions that are not just policy based. Come up with carbon filters, come up with, reducing. So you would be surprised to know that the maximum efficiency of a diesel engine in 2020 is 45%. So only 45% of the diesel that we use goes into the combustion of the engine. And this is to the best of my knowledge. Maybe there are other views, but this is what I know. So technology is one thing. Now come to policy. What are the three policy issues that are being talked about? One is, and I'm talking internationally because again, there's no one city solution to this. There can be improvements to drainage system and traffic lights so that there's lesser vehicular pollution, or parking systems, but there's no one city solution. So let's talk holistically. There's cap and trade, where you issue carbon certificates to industries, and then you create a market where those carbon certificates can be traded. So if I have 10 carbon certificates, one certificate is say 10 units of carbon emissions, whatever those units may be. And if I'm only using 8 or producing 8 carbon units worth of pollution, I can sell those 2 carbon units, carbon certificates that I have in abundance in a market, and then that market then kind of takes care of the price of carbon. So that is a market that you've created on your own. It has its own negatives, but I'm just giving you what is happening in the policy sphere. And I'm sure Abhay could add to this. The second thing is carbon tax, which I have an inherent issue with. But carbon taxes You pollute 10 and you pay X. That's how it works. So the inherent problem with that that I see is, if I'm rich, I can pollute more. If I have a small industry, I cannot pollute as much. That's my issue. But there are advantages to carbon tax as well, that you can employ all of those funds in R&D and technology, as I spoke of, or maybe betterment of policy and getting better brains to develop policies. So that's one. And the problem with Paris Climate Agreement and all of these goals that have been set out over the past few years for India, for the world, and what has been these developing countries, especially India's position against these, is that this is not equitable, because the climate change impacts that we're facing today, those are a function of everything that has been done by the developed countries 150 years back. And now when we're trying to eradicate poverty in our country, you're coming to me and you're telling me that you cannot put carbon in the air, which is wrong. So India has an equitable argument that if you got to pollute the environment, I should be allowed to. Obviously, there are people who phrase it better, but that's the crux of that argument. So there's this author, in fact, he's a columnist at The Guardian. He's written a book called Heat, George Manblot. I'll be happy to share the link to the book as well, who has basically come up with this idea that decide that there should be an X number of carbon that should be available in the atmosphere all around the globe on an average, which will help us sustain our current being, right? And then you divide that carbon by the number of people on the planet. Okay, so if there are 7.5 billion people on the planet, you divide it by 7.5 billion. That would give each country X amount for each of their persons to pollute, right? And you can plan it accordingly. You can give it to industries, individuals, whichever way you want it. And that is the more equitable solution, according to him. Again, there are a lot of issues with this as well, because I can see a couple of these dictatorial states on either side of our boundaries, and I don't want to name any, which can say that our population is actually 1 billion less. So we would then require more carbon credits. So it can be misused depending on where the conscience of the state lies. But that these are some of the theories. And the final issue with this whole thing is that it all comes down to this new trend, as Abhay absolutely brilliantly pointed out, that it has all come down to technology and cost benefit analysis. And we let Pallavi in his prior employments and all of these big four decide whether an environmental project should come up here or not. And all of that is dependent upon CBA, right? Cost benefit analysis. What is the cost of putting a hydroelectric power plant? What is the environmental cost of it? What is the cost of displacing 100,000 people from that little tribe that has stayed there for 200 odd years? And what are the benefits? You're giving electricity to, say, 300,000 people. This is the basic calculation.
Okay.
But my cost is just one second. My issue with this whole issue is, since ancient literature, I mean, Buddha attained salvation trying to figure out what is the meaning of life, what is the value of life. Now you're coming to term for 5 years and you have suddenly devised one formula where you have come up with the value of life, that to a human life is separate. So you have like 5 lakhs for a human life, you have 2 lakhs for a Black Panther, you have 150,000 for, I mean, like, you cannot come up with these CBA analysis just to justify every obnoxious act that you do against the environment, because you cannot calculate the inherent quality of life. And that was my rant, and also your answer to the question.
Perfect. I think, Abhay, I have a question which is directed to you from Shreyas. I think when a crisis hits, we see a lot of changes in how we respond to it, especially. So in the pre-COVID times, we've had the issue of single-use plastic, which was major issue, and now it's not discussed anymore. So the consistency and implementation of laws are dependent on the priorities, which do keep on changing. So the question is, what is the relation between crisis and law, particularly climate change perspective, and what kind of new laws and regulations we should expect in the future if the environment situation continues to deteriorate? So, and if it clashes with human rights in any ways.
Thank you. So that's a good question, and I'll also use this opportunity to sort of fold in my responses to Karmanye and I think it was Vivek who might not be with us, their comments as well. Uh, I think crisis often does result in fantastic legal movement, right? And you just look at the Bhopal industrial disaster in India, 1984, and then you have 2 years later India's umbrella environmental legislation, the Environment Protection Act of 1986 coming into place, right? And not soon thereafter, not too far away thereafter, the Environment Impact Assessment Law, which first appeared in the Hazardous Waste Rules of 1989, but was formulated as the EIA notification, the first notification of 94. So quite often crisis does move a sleeping giant into doing things. And it's good to acknowledge that this appears both nationally and internationally. When you had the ozone hole develop, that's when a lot of action around the Montreal Protocol internationally developed as well, right? When you have the ship Clemenceau coming to Alang, where for a long time shipbreaking has been happening and it continues to happen. But suddenly there's one full ship coming from France with lots of carcinogens, some response happens at the legal and policy level. So in that sense, if you're just correlating how law develops, it quite often develops as a response to a crisis situation. For me, the interesting point is, what does one do with this realization, right? As a policy advocate, as a teacher, as an enlightened citizen, that means that that is an opportunity space for you. And as Karmani was suggesting, what happened with Cyclone Amphan, for example, in the Sundarbans, is an opportunity space to point out that in India, all our talk is about mitigation, mitigation, mitigation. What about adaptation? What about helping the most vulnerable people either in Sundarbans or under a flyover next to Connaught Place in Delhi, who are lying on the city or someone on the roads in Gurgaon? How are you helping people legally? How is the policy helping people adapt to the impacts? And here I would suggest a slight, not necessarily a disagreement, but a new vista in light of what Eeshan said. I think India's equitable argument internationally is acceptable to me, but let's not forget that India is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, right? We might talk about per capita, we are 1/15th or 1/20th of the US, but as a country, we're a big emitter, right? That's one. Two, whatever we might do on the emission side, let's not forget that within the country, people are really dealing with the impacts of climate change in very, very different ways. I might be a rich character who can go into my home and put on my ACs and be chill. But if I'm on the streets of a blazing city, that heat wave will kill me. And heat waves do kill. It happened even in a country such as France to citizens of Europe within their air-conditioned homes, right? So excessive focus on mitigation for me is also missing the core justice issue, which is, let's talk about how to help people in India adapt to the impacts that we are seeing today, be it Cyclone Amphan or flooding of Gurgaon or heat waves or locust infestations or acidification or desertification. Everything is happening depending on where you look within India, and we need to use our law and policy to help people live in a dignified way, notwithstanding the fact that these impacts are being felt, and notwithstanding the fact that India internationally might say that I want a bigger part of the pie or not. The government and the law cannot run away from that obligation. Right? It's all well and good to sort of be noble in an international forum, but when your people domestically are dying today and you're not doing anything about it, for me that is unconstitutional and unjust, right? It is not in the spirit of a rule of law democracy. So I hope I responded to those multitude of questions by that consolidated response.
Great. Thank you so much, Abhay. I think you did. So in interest of time, I'm going to ask the last question, which was by Ashutosh. It's a secret question, which was, in a way, which means it was sent to me privately. So it's going to be a surprise. So the COP process is now over 25 years old, and there is still no global binding agreement in sight. How would you assess the contribution of climate scientists and climate lawyers to where we are today? In your net assessment, have their contributions been assertive or detrimental to the outcome we now have before us? He also says, as a disclaimer, it's an unfair question, but would love to hear your views. So, Eeshan, you first, and then Abhay, and then we'll wrap up the day.
Great. That's a really good question. Ashutosh, was it? That was a really good question.
Yes.
I promise to keep it short this time. So again, I've already mentioned that with environment, I really believe that even negative publicity is actually good publicity because it gets people talking, and the whole idea is to create a conversation about environment like you guys are doing and like all of these various platforms are doing today. COP has not, so you have to put it in terms with global politics, and environment, like I said, is not just about our interactions with human beings and land and water and other flora and fauna. It is also about diplomacy. It is about public policy. It is about, now China has dammed the rivers on our eastern borders, and we have the Indus issue with Pakistan. So these are water issues. These are diplomacy issues. And again, what Abhay said, that equitable argument of India, that's also a diplomatic issue now. So you have to understand, if there are 192 nations and how much ever are parties to the COP convention, with the conference of parties, you cannot assume that in 10 decades, I mean, you imagine it in this term, in this prism, through this prism, you get 10 of your friends who come from different backgrounds and try and make them agree on one issue. How difficult is it to do that? And then imagine 192 countries that have different histories, different backgrounds, different concerns for their environment or their population. So we have to be realistic in this aspect. However, I still think that COP has been not successful per se, but it has done things that will help guide this conversation forward. Paris was a decent step forward. It is a pity that the US ended up doing what it did with Paris, what it did with Kyoto, basically. But it is a step in the right direction. And I'm sure with the kind of policy analysts, with the kind of lawyers that I'm meeting in the climate space, not just in India, but in Norway, in South Sudan, in Peru, in Argentina, in the US, Canada, these people have the policy tools to make a difference. They're trying to employ as many of those as possible, but coming to a decision with 100 odd participants in one room is always going to be difficult. And ultimately, this awakening needs to come about that this is an existential crisis and not a fiscal crisis for these countries to get out of. So yeah, that's short, right?
I wish we had time. I think there's so much discussion, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time. Abhay, the second last
yes,
word.
I'll be short.
Last word's fine. Yes, all yours.
Thank you. I'll be super short as well. So Ashutosh, my sense is, yes, now finally climate scientists have been demonstrating both a spine and creativity in speaking to political power. So now, and when I say now, I mean the last 15 years or so, climate scientists have done a huge service to humanity by issuing a categorical warning that tipping points are being breached. There is no return here. Climate lawyers across the world have been doing a great job. And I can only mention Polly Higgins, a Scottish barrister, whose organization Stop Ecocide is currently on campaign to make ecocide a crime. They want to amend the ICC Rome Statute to introduce a new crime along with the old crimes of crimes against humanity, etc., of destruction of the earth. So I would say climate lawyers, a few of them have been great ever since the climate crisis was recognized as an issue. Climate scientists over the last 15 years are doing a wonderful job. In India, and this is my caveat, in India, climate scientists are still terribly scared to say anything. Including at the Indian Institute of Science in the city where I live, the top climate scientists within quotes teach at that university. And if I go and ask them to join a policy or a political discussion, they all freeze because they're worried about their jobs, right? So climate scientists in India need to develop a spine. There are some honorable exceptions. Climate lawyers in India are a breed that is not yet in existence. We are coming into existence. So all power to that emergent community. There are, again, very honorable exceptions to my general comment. So as usual, provocative to the end, but thank you for the question.
Okay. And I think that's one of the reasons why I kept it for last, even though it came in pretty early in the session. So thank you so much, Eeshan and Abhay. I think it was a wonderful session. Like I said, it was short of time. It was wonderful hearing from everyone. It shows from the questions we've had and comments. So thank you so much for both of you for sparing the time. And thank you everyone for joining in. We'll be sharing the ways to connect with Abhay and Eeshan. They've been kind enough. It's already there in the chat section, but we'll also drop you an email with the details. So thank you everyone and hope to see you next week. It's on the future of the aviation sector. So we would all love to know that, because at least I would.
I'd like to chime in as well. If,
Yes.
we'll probably be on the other side asking questions for once.
Yes, perfect, great.
But one thing that I just wanted to leave everyone with, and it just came to my mind when Abhay was talking about this. There was this professor of mine when I was young, who used to teach me energy law back at Stanford, and he used to say that what is the cheapest form of energy? Right? Because this is all going to, this environmental conversation is going to turn into an energy conversation. So what is the cheapest form of energy? The cheapest form of energy is the one that you do not use. So if we can change our habits, we probably have a chance.
That's, I think, the perfect way to wrap it up, Eeshan. I think it starts with every individual. So thank you so much and hope to see everyone next week, same time. Take care, guys. Have a great weekend. Take care. Bye.
Thanks,
so much.
Pallavi. Thanks, Shreyas. Thanks, Asian Pathfinders.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Abhay. Bye.
Bye, Ishan. See you soon.
See you.
See you guys.